It is good to be here this morning. I've been looking forward. We're starting a new series today, in case you didn't know. We're going to call it Tell Me a Story. Stories every kid should know, and you should too. So this is a kind of a series that's been mulling over in my mind for quite a while now. A friend of mine a couple of years ago had a little girl, and they started reading her Bible stories, and he said to me, "Wallace, these stories are awesome. Why don't we ever preach on them?" And so I was thinking, wow, we don't often talk about like children's stories, and we tell children these stories for a reason, because they teach them good values, like they're the fundamentals of faith. And to imagine that we as adults transition out of that and think that we're too good for these children's stories is just it's no good. So we are going to be spending some time looking at the fundamentals of faith through the lens of some children's stories. So if you are kind of new to faith, or if you maybe have been in church for a long time but really don't know exactly what's going on, this is a good series for you. I hope that you'll stick around for this series. Actually, this past week, a friend of mine sent me a message and said, Wallace, I really am interested in learning more. I want to know more about Scripture. And I thought, oh, great, that's awesome. I'm going to tell you how to do it. And then I became super overwhelmed. It's like, there are a lot of stories in here. How do I even begin to offer somebody to tell them how to kind of start working through this idea of the story? And because there are a lot, there like 2,000 pages. There's so many stories in here. So this is a for you who are young at heart, who need a refresher, or who just want to kind of stick around for some good stories. Right? So story, this idea of story is powerful. All right, stories. They teach values, they teach morals, they teach truths, they inspire us into a kind of a new vision for our life. And so the stories that we tell, the stories that we listen to, shape our understanding of life. Pause. Eric sounds awesome. Thanks for all the work Eric's doing to Roland while we're in transition between Gary and the new guy. I was a new guy for a while, and then David was a new guy for a while, and now we're going to have a new guy, so I'm looking forward to that. The story, this idea of story, it shapes the way we understand our life. The stories we tell and the stories we listen to shape the way we understand life. So the ongoing question we'll be talking through in this series is, it'll kind of be holding in the back of our minds, are what sort of stories are you telling around your dinner table? And I don't mean like literally dinner table, but what sort of stories are you telling around the water cooler? Because if we understand that stories shape the way that we understand and approach life, then we have to tell the good stories, right? So in this, I wonder if you have kids, are you telling these stories around your dinner table? Because it's super important. The stories that we tell shape the way we understand faith. They shape the way we understand our identity in this place. So if you have kids, I hope you're telling these stories. If you are married or in a relationship, I really hope you're telling these stories together, because the way that we tell these stories, they shape the way we interact with one another, shape how we love one another, shape how we understand our identity in a marriage, in a relationship, in the world. If you're single, if you're living alone or with roommates or whatever, I hope you're telling these stories with some trusted friends, with some people who really care about you and love you, because these stories are super important. They shape the way we understand our identity as children of God. So story shapes the way we interpret and understand. Here's the design behind the series. It doesn't matter how old you are, what sort of age child you are. Stories shape our worldview. So like I said, it can be a little overwhelming looking at these thousands of pages of stories and know where to start. So if I had to pick the most important stories that kind of convey faith, these 5 weeks are going to be them. So if your story doesn't get told, then don't hate me. It's okay. It's not because I don't like your story. It's just because we have 5 weeks and we can only do 5 stories. There are others that are super important, crazy foundational, but these are the 5 that I think really convey very important truths that every kid should know, no matter how old you are. So as we kind of go throughout this series, the kids in Crosswired are going to be talking about these stories while we talk about them in here. The youth are going to be talking about them a little bit in their conversations after the sermon. So as a family, you'll be able to kind of initiate this conversation together. And so we're starting in the beginning. It's a good place to start. Not the very beginning. We're starting on page 7, which is just a little bit after. So in the beginning, God created the world, right? And then after a little while, people turned away from God. They forgot about God. They got busy. They got their own lives. They got kind of chaotic, and they forgot about God. So here we enter into the story with an ark and a faithful person we know as Noah. So here are a few basics of the story. You probably know it. You've heard it growing up as a kid, but we're not going to assume that everybody knows the details. Here are kind of the Spark Note versions. Okay, so God created the world. We forgot about God. Like I said, we got busy. We got distracted. We kind of turned away. We began to think we could do it ourselves without God. And eventually God said, wow, nobody is remembering me. Nobody's going to church. Nobody is praying. Nobody's around. And so this, it breaks God's heart. Oftentimes, at least in my memory, I remember God was angry. God was angry, and so he's throwing lightning bolts and floods. But the kind of the tone that we hear in Scripture is a very sad God, almost like depressed, really mourning this loss. I hope you don't know this, but many of you may, as parents with children who kind of go their own way, don't want anything to do with you, don't call, don't visit, don't care about you. This sort of real sense of loss. And so this is the emotion that God is feeling, so much so that God says, maybe we should just start over. Maybe we should forget these last couple thousand years, these last 6 pages. Maybe we should start over. And so God, in a moment of sadness, says, because you have forgotten about me, you've got to go. And so God sends a flood, right? And, God says, Noah, build the ark. Noah builds the ark. He gets lots of mocking, lots of frustration from people. Then the animals go 2 by 2. I was going to sing the song in the worship, the animals, they go, the camp song. But so the animals go on the ark, the 40 days and 40 nights, the boats, and then the water stopped. All this time, Noah hasn't heard anything from God, by the way, so super lonely. And 40 days is, not maybe technically 40 days. It's the Bible's equivalent of a really long time. So we would say a few months instead of 40 days. So a few months later, water subside, the sun comes out, Noah sends out a dove, right? It comes back with nothing, which says there's no land. And then later, I think it was a week later maybe, Noah sent out the dove, comes back with an olive branch. So there's land, yes. So this is where we pick up the story of a rainbow and a covenant. So the rainbow is in the sky, and God picks up and says to Noah this. For the first time since the flood started, Noah heard the voice of God. God pointed to the rainbow and told Noah that God would never destroy the earth again with this water, with this destruction, because of people's sin, forgetfulness, anger. God would never, ever destroy again. And so we have this first covenant. Now, I'm not sure how Noah made it to be a children's story. As I'm telling nursery rhymes and stories to Lily and Liam, I'm realizing that a lot of them are pretty actually morbid and sick. Like Humpty Dumpty fell off a wall, right? Lots of them. Jack and Jill up the hill. And so here we have Noah. And Ryan, if you want to throw that picture up, this is the traditional understanding of Noah. This guy, Gustave Doré painted this picture, 1865. This is how people traditionally understood Noah. In case you can't see, it's this big boulder. On the boulder are people that are dying. There's a tiger eating them. There are people floating in the water that are dead. And somehow, over time, we've transitioned into this understanding of Noah. A more happy cucumber and tomato kind of understanding to tame it down a little bit so that kids can understand the morals of the story. And in that, I think it's important because we're conveying this truth. Thanks, Ryan. Get rid of that because people not pay attention to me. So over time, our culture has shifted, and I believe that that this story has stuck around for so long because it conveys maybe the most important piece of our understanding of God, and that is this key shift between God's contract of love to us before the flood, shifting into God's covenantal love of us after the flood. Contract versus covenant. It wasn't. Let's see. Yeah, it wasn't until I guess I started studying in Old Testament. My professor Ellen Davis that I started to unpack and deconstruct this difference between contract and covenant and how important it is for our relationship with God. So this is the way I understood my relationship with God. So as a kid, I read the story of Noah, and I remember, I still remember thinking very vividly that if I am bad, then God's going to flood me. That if I couldn't quite get to the rainbow piece. I was a more sensitive type as a kid. So I was very in tune to other people, and so I couldn't quite get to the rainbow because of all of these people that died. I couldn't quite get there. So the covenant meant nothing to me before that. And so I went on understanding this idea of covenant, the contract. If I'm good, God will be good to me. This is this idea of contract. And our culture over time has shifted, has understood, has sold out this idea of covenant to a more economically viable contract. And it makes sense. Like, contract is super important. Part of life. But we have contracts because we have people that we can't 100% trust. Right? So if I enter into a contract with Steve to buy a car, if I say, Steve, I'm going to buy your car, and I'll pay you $20,000 for your car, right? Wait, is that a deal? No. And we say, okay, and then I run off with the car and say, forget you, I'm not paying. So there are consequences for that. There are contracts. We have contracts when we buy houses, when we buy cars. We have contracts all throughout with our employers. We enter into a relationship with very clear expectations. And if you don't follow, then you lose your privileges. You lose whatever it is. And on the flip side, you probably know this word covenant. We throw it around a lot in weddings. We covenant to love one another. And I wonder if what we understand, if we have misconstrued covenant to understand it as a contract with a little love. So while we covenant to love one another in marriage before God and one another, I wonder if we more often end up saying, I'll stick with you through love, through until death do us part, as long as I get what I need out of this relationship. Or I wonder if we enter into a kind of an unspoken covenant with a friendship that I'll stick with you no matter what until you start complaining too much, and then I'm gone. I wonder if what we have come to believe as covenant is really more of a contract with terms made in love. Because we function most comfortably in contractual relationships, it's very easy to transition to our relationship with God as a contract. So see if any of this sounds familiar to you. God, I'll pray every day for the rest of my life, I promise, as long as I can get this big promotion. Or eyes in the rearview mirror, the blue lights flashing. God, I promise I was planning to go to church in the morning. I promise I will go if you can just get me out of this situation. Or God, I promise I won't sleep with my girlfriend ever again if you can just get me out of this pinch. Or God, if you can just get me through this day, I promise I won't ever party like that ever again. Contract is bargaining to get out of jail free card. Contract. Or what about this? If I go to church, if I go to Bible study, if I go to choir, if I lead a committee, if I don't cuss too much, if I don't drink too much, if I don't smoke pot, then God will bless me with a healthy life, a fat bank account, a beautiful wife, a good life. Contract. If I am good, God will give me good things. Or what about this? Any of this sound familiar? I had a wild 5 years of college. I must be struggling in life now because of what I did in the past. I'm battling cancer now because I was unfaithful in the past. Or my marriage has ended because I was not going to church like I should have. Or my kids are all the time in trouble as God's revenge to me because of my past. Contract. If I'm bad, God will punish me. See, life spent in contract to God is deeply depressing place to be because it's impossible. It's impossible. This contractual relationship makes sense, though, and if we're honest, it's maybe a reason why a lot of you are here today. I don't know. But at the end of the story, of this Noah story, God changes. Fundamentally changes the way that God interacts with me. Because before the flood, because we were bad, God killed the people. And then at the end of the story, God says, I will covenant to never do that again. Covenant says, I am bonding myself to you. Not like we're going to go spend time together and bond, but I am bonding myself to you. Walter Brueggemann, famous Old Testament scholar, says this, by establishing a covenant with the people, God sets a promise